The Old Testament reading is Genesis chapter 22, beginning with the first verse. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and tell him and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the ass. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. My son Joel just finished his 3rd grade a couple of weeks ago now. By the way, I always do get permission from my children to share their stories now. I used to not do so, but they're getting older now, and so I need to make sure he's okay with me sharing these stories. I don't know what spawned this moment, but as he graduated from 3rd grade, I just kind of set him down and got on my knees, and I told him, Joel, there will come a time when you will no longer want to hang out with me as you get older. You're going to prefer to hang out with your friends far more being around your daddy. And I want you to know that that's okay. Daddy will always love you. Daddy will always be here for you. And it's going to be okay. I thought it was a nice thing to say to my son. A couple of days later, it's dinner time. The entire family's gathered. And my son Joel started crying in front of his mother, which gets me in trouble. And he said, Daddy, I don't want to grow up because I don't want to hang out with my friends more than spending time with you. This is a few days before Father's Day, but I took the early Father's Day present from my son. Hannah's like, why would you say such a thing to your son and get him all upset? I thought I was preparing him for the future, honey. Abraham is 75 when he receives a call from God to leave everything that he's known to a land that he's never been. He's promised by God, despite having no children, that you will be a father of a nation. The fulfillment of that promise takes another quarter of a century. He is 100 years old when Isaac is born. Can you imagine how much Abraham loves Isaac? Yeah. How much he adores his son. Did you hear what Kevin read today? Did you hear his words from Genesis chapter 22? We read, after these things, God tested Abraham. One of marks of discipleship is testing. Testing of what? What are we looking at here? Akedah is a Hebrew word for binding. binding of Isaac, sacrifice of Isaac, a son he was finally given after 100 years. He's called to sacrifice. The first question that we might ask ourselves is this: why did the ancient writers include this story anyways? Why put it here? So much here that we can't comprehend. So much here that violates our sensibilities. So much here that does not conform to our expectations. How can God ask us such a thing, to sacrifice Isaac, the culmination of the promises of God for Abraham and all of his future descendants? Wouldn't the ancient writers know that we would be deeply offended by such a thought? That we would be tempted to perhaps look for a different kind of God that is more to our liking, a different kind of God who might be more palatable for our taste. Despite the complaints, we are offered no explanation. Alexander White, an Edinburgh pastor from the late 1800s, he does not try to psychologize or moralize this story of Akedah, but instead he writes, "I do not understand this dark dispensation of God. All is dark. It's midnight to me." In order for us to even begin to contemplate this test, we must first look at the person that is Abraham. Abraham stands as a prototypical person of faith. Faith as not as a doctrine that ought to be taught, but faith as something that is lived. Faith as a way of being. Here we see Abram called in chapter 12 of Genesis to leave a place that he has called home for 75 years to a place that he does not know. Abraham trusting obediently about the things that he cannot control. Abraham being obedient to a God whom he cannot see. Abraham stands as a witness. When we engage in faith, we let go of control. Faith means to choose to live a life apart from only relying on hard-earned empirical knowledge, as glorious and impressive as these things may be. And instead, we choose to engage and live into a life embracing the mystery. We enter a life where we no longer attempt to dictate the terms of our own lives or the lives of others, but instead we live life just as they are given to us through the highs and lows as gifts. Story is Abraham, his life, and therefore his faith goes against the self-narratives of our world. Self-help, self-health, self-care, self. So much self goes out the window. For these things are commercial at best and destructive most of the time. This kind of life that Abraham lives comes at a considerable risk. But when we choose to live a life like this, engage in a life this way, it enables us to inhabit a new reality that was previously unperceived by us. While Abraham is known as the father of faith, we might notice as we read Genesis, we are given shockingly little details of his life. Despite living 175 years of life, we're given 17 stories. It's as if the Bible is warning us to deliver us from the temptation of copying somebody else's faith. For each and every one of our faith journeys are unique. It is our own. God is with us still. So much of Akedah, Genesis chapter 22, is informed to me through the studies of Eugene Peterson, who's no longer with us. He writes these words: "Today, faith is often cliched into a feeling or illusion or a disposition of a wish upward. An inclination easily disappear by a gust of wind or a distraction of a pretty face. So a way of faith requires a repeated testing so that we can discern whether we are dealing with a living God or some fantasy that we cooked up in a melting pot of lust and anger, envy and sloth, pride and greed." So we need testing. Testing of faith that involves timely rescue from self-deceit, gracious deliverance from our self-delusions. And this test is conducted through means of sacrifice. Sacrifice exposes spiritual fantasy as a masquerade of faith, and with every sacrifice there exists cleansing of the toxin of acquisition, life of getting replaced by life of receiving. Receiving the promises, receiving the covenants, receiving Isaac, receiving the ram in the thicket. American poet Jeannie Walker writes, "Sacrifice is as slow as a funeral procession in a rush hour traffic. A sort of word, other words pass honking." Sacrifice is as slow as a funeral procession in a Charlotte rush hour traffic. A sort of word, other words pass honking. Relinquishment is a prerequisite for fulfillment. Letting go of the cramped self-will allows space for the expansive life that God has in store for you, for me, for the church. Sacrifice is the only means of which faith can mature. There's no two ways about it. Sacrifice is the only ways in which one's faith can mature. But here's the good news: sacrifice is not a diminishment. Sacrifice is no diminishment. It does not result in less joy. It does not result in less fulfillment. It does not result in less contentment, but so much more of these things, just in ways that we did not expect. And there's no need to be glib or romanticize sacrifice. The binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac, stands in protest toward the temptation to be glib about sacrifice. We need repeated reality checks. Are we using God, or are we letting God use us? Am I living under God's term, or am I constructing my God in such a way that God will be under my terms? Do I serve God, or am I a simple consumer testing God to see if this God can be profitable commodity for my personal endeavors and conquests? So our faith, your faith, need testing. Here's the bad news: we cannot be trusted to test ourselves. We are too full of self-deceit and self-interest. We are too devious to devise ways of cooking the books in our favor, to twist the narrative in our own ways, to serve our illusions of greed, anger, tyranny, ambition, pride, and violence? Do we want God in our own image, or do we seek to live a life in the image of God as we are created by God? The test will tell us. In the binding of Isaac, Akedah, we witness to the truth that we must be the ones to be tied down in such a way that we can be liberated, to live out our faith life, to trust God without any calculations. Once again, Eugene Peterson preaches these words: untested faith is nothing more than a cultural cliche. And to be sure, while Abraham is a veteran of testing and sacrifice, he does not always pass the test. Abraham fails the test and fails often. He failed at Gaylord. Abraham fails the test at Egypt. Abraham fails the test with Sarah. Abraham fails the test with Hagar and Ishmael. But with each test, Abraham is left with less of himself and more with God. With each and every test, Abraham let go of self-sovereignty and embraces God's sovereignty, and he does this for over 100 years. And perhaps having done this for 100 years, maybe by now Abraham knows and trusts God willingly. And so he goes on this 3-day journey to Mount Moriah to do that which is unthinkable. There's a striking similarities between Genesis 12 when Abraham is called to Genesis 22 when Abraham is called. So he went. So Abraham went. Faith means that we put our trust in God. Faith means that we trust that God knows what God is doing and that God will work out our salvation. We don't know how God will work out our salvation, but we trust that God will work out our salvation. Mount Moriah is a centerpiece of faith that culminates with Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus prays, "Not my will, but thine." Thanks be to God. Amen.